Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Shakespeare Hour. It's very nice to see you all as we go live for another week and another series, another season. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. And well, we're sort of evolved in a new format, which is we're not going to be doing our show every week as we used to, but we're going to be doing one show per theatre presentation through the season. And this evening, we're going to be talking about The Amen Corner by James Baldwin, which I'm very excited and proud to say is the show that we have reopened with. Yes, last Friday was the press night. We gathered together in the Sydney Harmon Hall once again, and the show happened. It returned, and it was filled with all the glory that we so appreciated when it was on at the Sydney Harmon Hall just before the lockdown arrived. So we've sort of come full circle. But one of the topics tonight is going to be how has the play continued to speak to us, both before the pandemic and post the pandemic. Before I start and introduce our wonderful panelists tonight, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Well, Shakespeare Hour Live is made possible through the visionary support of the Beach Street Foundation. And tonight's episode is generously sponsored by Sandy and John Willen. My thanks very much to all of them. Shakespeare Theatre Company's 2021-2022 season as a whole is made possible by Michael R. Klein and Joan Fabry, and of course the Harmon Family Foundation as well. So what an extraordinary group of supporters we have, how lucky we are to be continuing to tell amazing and huge stories in the nation's capital, and how nice that you're joining us tonight to talk about those shows and and share our experiences of being back at the theatre, about James Baldwin more widely, and the Amen Corner. And of course, if you have any ideas and thoughts, responses and questions, please fire them onto the chat button. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the Amen Corner. This was a play that I very much wanted to do when I first arrived in 2019, when I got the job running the Shakespeare Theatre Company. We did a reading of the play with some local actors to sort of explore it. And it was clear then, just by reading it, that this was a remarkable text that had a tremendous passion, energy, and modernity, vibrancy, and it was also extremely moving. So we quickly moved to organising a production. Whitney White, who is now, I'm very pleased to say, part of the SCC staff, came on board as the director. And one thing led to another, and the show was launched on our biggest stage. And it was really a thrill to return to a play that had actually first been performed at Howard University in the 1950s and not been seen in Washington since. So there were many interesting residences, both nationally and locally. So to talk about the play and its ongoing meaning and resonance, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Rich Blint, who is the Assistant Professor of Literature at the New School and Director of the program there on race and ethnicity. He is the author and editor of numerous pieces and collections on the work of James Baldwin, and his upcoming books include A Radical Interiority, James Baldwin and the Personified Self in Modern American Culture, and A Queer Spirit, Incidents in the Life of the Americans. Hello, Dr. Rich Blint.
Hello, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very nice to welcome you to the show, if I may call you Rich.
Please do. Please do.
Thank you. And Rich, I believe you're in Manhattan this evening.
I am.
And how is that feeling? How is New York?
New York is opening, busy, alive, coming back. It's I think Google purchased a $2.1 billion office on the Hudson. So things are coming back. We are all here.
Raring to go. Goodness me. And tell me, Rich, have theatres reopened? I mean, do you get a sense of the theatre culture in New York kind of returning?
The theatre has reopened. They opened, some of the big productions opened last week. I've only been to the 92nd Street Y Thursday, I think, to see Colin Twain, the Irish master himself, talk about his new book on Thomas Mann. It was a small bunch of us. It was a hybrid event with some people at home and some people in the audience, but I wanted to see Colin myself. So I went in person, which was my first time in 18 months. Wow. A little nerve-wracking with mask on, but
yeah. And did the master live up to your hopes?
So, absolutely. I mean, I haven't read the massive volume yet, but Colin's beautiful distillation was great. And there was also Beethoven playing by the Vienna String Quartet. So it was gorgeous. It was a beautiful evening. So that's my inauguration to kind of coming back into the theater. And I'll be in DC to see the production this Friday. So I'll be in a theater again for the second time this Friday. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's great. Well, we're so happy that you're coming to see the show, and I'm sure it's going to be interesting seeing the show. Also, having talked about it so much this evening, and of course all your long-term work on James Baldwin, and I hope folks that are watching, some of you would have seen the show already, and of course there's still a chance to see it. If you, like Rich, are in Washington over the weekend, then you can catch the show at the Harmon Hall. Dr. Soyica Colbert, SCC's Associate Director, Literary and Co-Dramaturg of the Amen Corner, is also with us. She's the Interim Dean of Georgetown College and the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts at Georgetown University. Soyica, very nice to see you.
Very nice to see you too. Good evening.
Good evening. Now, Soyica, we've been talking about theatres reopening. Now, of course, you're deeply involved in the university. How has all that side of life been, with students flooding back, or have they?
All of the students are back at Georgetown and excited as clams to be there. A drop-off weekend, the parents were elated, having had their kids home for 18 months. The students were happy to be back on campus. So there still has been a little, trepidation because we're doing things newly again, but it's been good. It's been a really great beginning to the fall.
Have you been invigorated by this sense of folks being back in person? Has that kind of changed your experience day to day?
It has. I mean, the campus feels completely different when students are there versus when they're not. And last year, there's a tempo to students being on campus. So you're used to them not being around over winter break, or, there being a lull in the summer. But I do remember last spring, some days walking on campus and it feeling a little eerie because it was so quiet. So this fall, having students back, it felt like we were back to being a university again in important ways.
So tremendous. Thank you. That's so heartening to hear. Also with us tonight is Grace Ann Roberts, STC's loyal line producer, the veteran of many Shakespeare lives. Grace Ann, how are you?
I'm great. It's so good to be back. I can see all of our viewers back in the chat. So many of you excited to be with us. It is, after all, a Wednesday night. So it feels good to have the Shakespeare Hour in its usual slot again. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Grace Ann. And last but certainly not least, my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, SCC's resident dramaturg. Good evening and welcome, Drew.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rich and Soyica and Grace Ann for joining us. And it feels kind of nice to be back doing this. It was a kind of a safe harbor for many of us during the pandemic to have this virtual community, and it's a tradition that is continuing. One of James Baldwin's favorite Shakespeare quotes, which he often cited from Henry IV, Part 1, "Out of this nettle danger, we pluck this flower safety." And I like to think that out of the nettle of the world, the dangerous world out there, we have this flower of the Shakespeare Hour Live, a safe harbor for us to come back to and to discuss great plays and great ideas. And as you were saying, Simon, the Amen Corner is a play of truly Shakespearean scope and impact. Brief history, as you were saying, it premiered here in Washington, D.C. in 1953, I believe.
1955.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Rich. The Howard University Players, and I'm sure you can tell us more about that soon, but it took, I believe, 10 years for it to reach Broadway. And in the preface to the play, Baldwin wrote that fact says more about the American theater than it does about this author. And he goes on to say a number of very stimulating things in the preface to the Amen Corner, which is Baldwin's writing, I think, at its finest, as indeed is this play. So I thought we would start maybe by talking a little bit about where Baldwin was in his life and in his career when he wrote the Amen Corner, because he had just, I believe, published his first novel and was writing some of his earliest works of nonfiction, essays. So he was sort of at a turning point, deciding what kind of writer he was going to become. Is that right, Rich?
Yes. I mean, what I would say is Baldwin had published Mountain, Go Tell on the Mountain, a few years before, had been at McDowell Colony and also at Yaddo, and had heard about Owen Dodson, who he'd heard good things about, and made his way down to DC with Arnold, one of his lovers, as you might all have read and known. And at that point was trying to figure out what to do. He was a writer who just simply had one book under his belt and was trying to figure out, against the wishes of his agent, what it might mean to get something on board called a play. So it was a moment of transition, to be sure, but Baldwin himself understood the power of the stage to kind of enliven not only audiences, but to do something quite dangerous. You know, I mean, a play or a novel, as he said later on, if it's successful, if it achieves its goal, it's really quite dangerous. So I think his long-time ambition to have a play was to have that immediacy, the kind of energy that happens in the theater between the audience and the actors, make something that powerful come alive. So it was a real transitionary time for him. It was the Howard players weren't professional, but they were professional enough, you know what I mean? So he was really quite pleased with how it came out. But he also, at the same time, was coming into his own. He met in DC, not to go on too long about this, but the wonderful E. Franklin Frazier, Sterling Brown, some amazing people who would later be important to him in his career. So I think that first production of Amen was really meaningful for him, you know?
Yeah, and of course it was before the publication of Notes of a Native Son.
He was working at the same time, and you know, they both came out in 1955. 54 and 55 were very productive years for him. He was also beginning to wrestle with a very kind of preliminary draft of Giovanni's Room, you know.
So he's on the cusp of becoming this major literary figure.
Well, it wouldn't happen until 63. So we're talking about 8 years, really, when Baldwin, you know, hits the covers of Time magazine. And this is before, as you know, Another Country that comes out in 62. So like he's, as he says in the preface, he's a one author person taking a real risk. I mean, he calls his decision to do a play kind of not reckless, but irresponsible, you know, as his agent was counseling not to do it, but he needed to get this out. And we can talk some more about why this play connects to Mountain and certainly to the collection of essays that would come out that same year.
I can't wait to talk about that, but I want to make Soyica a part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. And Soyica, you were saying, so obviously you followed this production the whole way as one of the dramaturgs on it, and saw the original mounting of it back before the pandemic. But you also were saying just before we went on the air that you taught a seminar at Georgetown on Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and Nina Simone, who all knew each other very well and were all very involved in each other's lives and careers. And I'm wondering if that classroom experience made you reflect on the Amen Corner in a new or different light, or Baldwin himself.
Yeah, I mean, it was helpful because I traced, and I had known this, but I thought about it more deeply when I taught the class, that they briefly overlapped living in New York at the same time. And then all of them were coming into their selves as artists in the 1950s. And so there was this coming of age together as artists that they shared, and they knew one another. Baldwin and Hansberry knew one another, and Hansberry and Simone were friends, and she was sort of the connective tissue. But all three of them had a relationship, were friends with one another. And so this 50s work, you really see on all three of them experimenting and coming into their own. I think Hansberry's most successful work is 1959 in terms of commercial success with Raisin in the Sun. But one of the things that was striking to me about preparing for tonight's conversation is just the profound proliferation of art and political impact of the year 1955. So you have the production of Amen Corner, which I think is an important part of Baldwin's career, even though it doesn't become a centerpiece in some of, the retelling of it or in terms of people's recognition of him. Although after this production, maybe it will. But he's more well known, as Rich said, for publishing Notes of a Native Son in 1955. You have the Montgomery bus boycott, the death of Emmett Till. You also have, which I think is important for our contemporary moment, the off-Broadway production of Trouble in Mind by Alice Childress, who was also friends with Hansberry and was living in New York, and now 60 years later is being produced on Broadway for the first time. So it really was a dynamic period for Black arts and activism, and obviously Baldwin was a huge part of both of those, both artist and activist.
And Rich, you were saying before, I second that point, 1955, this idea of the ferment that is happening and all of these connections and opportunities that are opening up for Black writers to be reaching a kind of stage. And it almost feels like a race to Broadway, and Lorraine in some ways gets there first in 59 with Raisin and Son, but it very easily could have been Childress, could have been Baldwin, and history as we know it could have been entirely different until this production, as you were saying, of the Amen Corner. But Rich, you were saying that there's connections also with Go Tell It on the Mountain and other works of Baldwin, this very personal story. Do you mean the setting of the play in this Harlem street front church, similar to the one that Baldwin himself grew up in, perhaps?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what connects all three works, Notes, Mountain, and Amen Corner, is this embrace, this kind of looking inward of his own interior life, his own interior theater, pardon the pun, his own mental theater, and trying to work out some of those ghosts. And so in the figure of David, but also Luke in the play, Baldwin is able to literally, again, restage, literally, his relationship with his family, with his complex relationship with the church. And he's able to kind of have a do-over, as it were, in the fictional positioning of that final deathbed conversation with his father, who, encourages him to go out into the world as a musician in that instance. But it's really Baldwin who, in actual life, leaves the church and leaves home on the same day. David does that in Amen Corner, right? He goes out, as Luke says, into the world. He's in the world. And to go back to what you said in quoting Baldwin's Shakespeare moment about this nettle danger, we pluck this flower safety. He doesn't want to be safe, right? The way Margaret is insisted throughout the entire play and throughout her entire life, that somehow the church would save all of them from the ravages, of American empire, of American racial apartheid. And it turns out that she was wrong about that. Now, the thing that can save you is to be fully immersed in the world, fully present in the world, to try as best as you can to use your art to vomit up all that anguish, to say something about the people who love you and who you love to make the world a little bit better. And so what is so powerful about the Amen Corner, in my reading of it now, to be very honest, I wasn't a huge fan of the play when I was a teenager, when I first read it at 17. You'll forgive me for this, I hope. Reading it later in life was much more incredible and revelatory and kind of orienting, not kind of orienting, powerfully orienting in the trajectory you can see with his own literary, philosophical, existential project. Because Baldwin is simply trying to say something about how one doesn't go under, how, like his best friend Eugene Worth, who jumps off the George Washington Bridge, which he writes about in another country 6 years later, he wanted to be sure that he saved his own life. And so to see Amen literally restage that peculiar drama, that kind of arresting drama, David goes out into the world, Baldwin goes to Paris. And so it connects John from Mountain, David from Amen with Mr. Baldwin himself in Notes of a Native Son.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. It reminds me, hearing you talk, Rich, the original title, or one of the original titles, was A Hiding Place for this play. And this idea of the church serving as a kind of place to hide from the world rather than to be in it certainly seems to reflect some of Baldwin's view, although I don't think we can reduce his views on spirituality that simply. Simon, you have a point that you were very eager to make.
Well, yes, I was just so interested hearing about the background and where the play kind of came from. And I'm just conscious of a parallel with Shakespeare, of how suspicious Shakespeare is of fanatics that want to hoard themselves up into any particular position. I'm thinking of Isabella and Measure for Measure, or indeed Angelo, and how Shakespeare was so alive to the way that people can imprison themselves in the church as a kind of actually escape, and that the worldliness that you're describing, Rich, being a destination which we all should aspire to be, feels absolutely on theme with Shakespeare. I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about music in the play, because something that's so overwhelming when one experiences in the theatre is the use of music. And Whitney, I know, has really invested in that part of it. But But yes, it feels to be still very unusual and very special, Baldwin's relationship to music. So I'd love you to talk about that. And the other thing I wonder whether you could also touch on, I'm going to ask you two questions at the same time, if I may, which is how the play was received when it eventually made it to Broadway. And indeed a kind of 2B question, which is, why do you think the play has been neglected for so long? Why is it so rarely been staged in America? So music, how it was received originally on Broadway, and its sort of reputation and life since then. Back to you, Rich.
I think the music of the play is powerfully evident, right? I mean, the music of the play comes out of the music of the church, certainly the music, the rhythm, the beat of the language. The music of Amen Corner, it seems to me, comes directly out of the music of Go Tell on the Mountain. As you know, Baldwin leaves for Paris in November of 1948 with $40 in his pocket, trying again not to go under after his father dies. And he has, as you said, he spirals downward very quickly, lands in a hospital in Paris, also in jail, for stealing a bedsheet. Falsely accused of stealing a bedsheet. And then he, as he says, he pulls himself together, goes to Lucien Hasberger's chalet in the Bernese Alps in Switzerland. And he takes with him Bessie Smith's Faswala and Sidney Bechet to give him what he says the key to the language that gives him Go Tell on the Mountain. So the beat of Amen Corner, his incredible listening ear, turns up right away. I mean, so when Baldwin overheard someone say that the Amen Corner at Howard set the speech department back 30 years. This is the anxiety of a certain politics of respectability that prevailed, I imagine, at the time. And one kind of laughs at that, right? But in actual fact, that's one of the most powerful things of the play is the beat of it and his non-diminishing, not refusal of caricature, but his absolute ear for Black voice, for Black people, which confers a certain kind of grace and love to his characters, So I think that's why, one of the many reasons why the music is so important. To your other two questions, I think the reception was mixed. I mean, Baldwin says in the preface to the play that comes out in 1968 that it's, he's not interested in conquering Broadway, but Black people need witnesses in this world that thinks everything is white. And I'm not trying to mimic or imitate Baldwin, but I think that both Blues and Mr. Charlie and in Amen Corner emerge because of what can happen on the stage, that powerful energy exchange that can transform people. And so I think his commitment to playwriting and to the Amen Corner itself is less about Broadway, the great white way, and more about what he thought he could do or introduce into the American theater, which hasn't been there before. So the reception interests me less than somehow his dogged attempt to get the play staged. And your third question, Simon, please remind me the third part of your question.
Yes, it was interesting to come to America as I did in 2019, and I had seen the play in London at the National Theatre in England, but to come and share the idea of doing the play and people not really to know it in America, or at least in DC. And I was just curious about why you feel it had kind of dropped out of the repertoire, or perhaps it never been in the repertoire in a way. Your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a beautiful, interesting question, and one interesting for me, and I'm really interested to find out from other people what they think about this. I think Baldwin is largely falsely accused of only being the greatest essayist in the African-American literary tradition or the American tradition, right? And that somehow that's different from the kind of intellectual projects that turn up in the novels and the short stories and in the plays. For him, he was telling one tale, right? He was simply trying to vomit out the anguish and shape a kind of narrative of Black life that would say something meaningful about the world we inhabit, about this country that was terrorizing them. And so in some ways, the plays were not in the repertoire, in the canon, the Baldwin canon. I mean, most of Baldwin critics wrongly suggest that Baldwin is, as I said, an essayist, and that his literary talents fall off after 1962, So I think absolutely accounts for the kind of dismissal of a powerful play like this, which I think is much more successful literarily than Blues for Mr. Charlie, to be very honest. I would love to know what you all think of this. But I think that accounts for it, that people have real anxieties about that. I mean, think about where the play is staged. I mean, setting the department back 30 years. This is, before, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. People were anxious, it seems to me, and still yet, people are also a little bit narrow in thinking that the essays, Baldwin as spokesperson, is the only one that counts. And as he says in the preface, and it's the last thing I'll say for now, is that his agent was very annoyed with him or worried about him or found the prospect more reckless and unreasonable, because it's true that most writers with one novel under their belts shouldn't be going off into another genre. But he had a story to tell, which is directly connected, as I'm trying to make clear, to 3 separate pieces of Mr. Baldwin,
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Yes, Soyica, I know you'd like to come in with some thoughts on any of those topics. Thank you, Rich, for outlining those ideas so brilliantly. Yes, Soyica.
And just listening to Rich talk, it's illuminating some aspects for me that I hadn't thought about the play before, because, we discussed in the production some that Baldwin, particularly after Raoul Peck's film and contemporary context, we know Baldwin for the Preacher Leaf, for the fiery Baldwin that's captured in speeches on YouTube that, was animated by the Times cover story in The Fire Next Time. And all of that is related to his history as a boy preacher. But what this conversation is reminding me is the other aspects of what he brought with him from the church that continue to animate his work. And so that is part of the musical tradition that we're hearing discussed. It's also part of, I think, his deep commitment to what he describes as communion as a way of coming together. And so why the theater is important is because it sets the stage for coming together, but it also allows for a kind of intimacy that Baldwin was deeply invested in, and that you might not capture completely when you're only seeing snippets of his speeches or his debates. And so it's really lovely to see the vulnerability and the intimacy and relationship that emerges in Amen Corner, in Notes of a Native Son, as he's grappling with his father's death. And Go Tell It on the Mountain. And so in all 3 of those early texts, you really see the animation of Jeremiah Baldwin. You see the animation of, these questions around intimacy and community. And you also see his deep love for Black culture and how he was, saw that through the church. There are all these characteristics of Black life that he learned in the church that even though he left, he took with him. And you can see that if you engage with the play.
Yeah, just circling back to this question you had about the music, Simon. Obviously, I'm an outsider. I did not grow up in the Black church, but it seems to me like one of the keys dramaturgically to how it functions in the play is exactly what, Soyica, you're talking about. The way it works in this multifocal way, where it's simultaneously a kind of loving commemoration and tribute to gospel and that tradition. And it's also pointing towards the influence that Black gospel music would have on all of American popular music and secular music. And it feels very loving and intimate and lived in, while at the same time, it's Baldwin himself as an outsider, really interested in representing what he calls in the preface to the play, obscure aspects of Negro life, when of course they are central. They are central aspects. They are simply aspects of life. And that's what's kind of radical about the play, is also its humanism, that these are real human beings that are part of the American story. And I want to tell these stories on Broadway, on the biggest stage possible, regardless of whether my agent thinks it's a good thing for my career or not. That feels like a very, noble gesture on his part to say, I think this is important and this needs to be said. So the music, it functions almost like a Greek chorus commenting on the play, or it functions like a jukebox musical maybe, as a kind of heightening, theatricalizing of the play. It functions in such an interesting way. It's intrinsic to the call and response rhythms that underlie every single one of the speeches and all the dialogue in the play. I'm really curious, Rich, when you see the show, for your thoughts on this, because I think it's one of the things that Whitney and her direction and the ensemble really nail completely. Yes.
I've heard the same. I'm sorry. I've heard the same thing about the success of the music and the acting and the production generally. I'm excited to see it. The thing I want to say, just to follow up on what you just said, is what Soyica was saying, is that what he was saying about the kind of obscure aspects of Negro life was about that Broadway is not interested, right? Now that he wasn't interested. And he's preoccupied by, we were talking about safety before, but about love. Like, what is it about American life, about American apartheid, American Jim Crow, that what effect does that have on the familial lives of Black people? How does it separate Black men from Black women, from Black parents, from their children? How does it, narrow the set of possibilities and futures for individuals who have been marked, right? And so what has to happen in the domestic space, which is then transferred to the stage, is a different kind of encounter where both the safety of the church is rendered, toxic effectively at play's end. And it's really wonderful to see both the London production be so successful and well reviewed, and this one be so well embraced, so wonderfully embraced, because that's a simple proposition, it seems to me, that Baldwin is simply trying to work out that violence, the structure of that violence, and how one gets over it. And the fact that Sister Margaret is able to come to that realization that love really never dies, right? That she needs to let her child go is one of the most achievements of Amen Corner.
Yes, I absolutely second that, and I'm recalling as you're speaking, Rich, the scene where she also embraces her dead husband at the end.
Yes. I mean, love never dies, right? And I think Baldwin says in a wonderful film called Meeting the Man, James Baldwin in Paris, shot in 1970 by some British filmmakers, that love has never been a popular movement and no one's ever really wanted to be free. Love has never been a popular movement and no one's ever really wanted to be free. Freedom requires a set of responsibilities, projects all kinds of dangers, meaning that you can't lay back in a set of categories, right? The Lord can't stand in for everything. You see Luke throughout the play when he returns, chiding Margaret about, well, wasn't there a time when there wasn't the Lord? It never, you were a person, you're an individual. And so I think people have to choose to be involved in someone else's life in a way that's dangerous for them, right? That's one of the reasons why both David and Baldwin has to enter the world, because even though it's dangerous, even though you might not quite make it, which is a lot of so many of us marked in the world of US empire, but you have to go into the world and see what you can make of it. You have to do your work, or as Baldwin says, kind of harshly, otherwise you're useless. He says in the play, I have work to do.
Yes.
And that kind of noble, claim, that noble ambition is the Baldwinian ambition, right? In the Jeremiah tradition, as Soyica so rightly pointed out,
Brilliant. Well, Grace Ann, we might have some questions from our audience in a second. Shall I do my little interval announcement first, and then we'll have some questions, and then we'll, I think, delve in and have a look at some of the a scene from the play together. So, as I mentioned earlier, this year Shakespeare Live is taking a different format. We're doing a production-based series of broadcasts. So, we're going to have one episode for each production in our season, and we hope that you can see the dates on your screen now of all our forthcoming Shakespeare Hour Lives, and we hope you'll join us for more exciting conversation throughout the season. Okay, well, brilliant. Well, look, Grace Ann, over to you as we after we just looked ahead there. How are our audience tonight? What are they thinking and feeling, Sharon?
They're great. So just before you kind of passed it to me, Simon, I got a slew of new questions, but I'm going to start with one that was asked a little while ago by a viewer. And I'll direct it to the whole group, obviously. But Soyica, I'm really interested in your perspective on what viewer BJ Serrata asks. He asks, they ask, what was James Baldwin's relationship to women artists early and later in his career and in his life, his relatives or his friends? Obviously, I can't read that question without thinking of Lorraine Hansberry, maybe some other women artists or figures in his life come to mind, but I'd love to ask that one first. So maybe I'll give it to you, Soyica, and we can go from there.
Yes. So when I taught the Baldwin Hansberry Simone class, we read this essay, Sweet Lorraine, which Baldwin wrote as a eulogy to her. And I said, you would live a blessed life if you had a friend who could write about you in such tender terms. They were fast friends. She came to see a reading of one of his plays. They didn't know each other well. And he recalls that she was sitting up in the balcony, and the producers and everyone who had come to hear the play were ripping it apart. And she yelled out from the balcony, "I liked it." And so after that, or something to that effect, and an affirmation. And after that, they became fast friends. And he also recalls that there was a controversy that emerged after Raising the Sun about her parents' real estate holdings, her father's, who had passed away but had left her family in real estate holdings, and Baldwin coming over to reassure her and to offer her some support because he knew how hard that was. So, Baldwin and Hansberry were both young artists. They overlapped, as I said, in New York. They were both queer. And they shared a lot of intimacy with one another and a familiarity and a knowing, a real intimacy, because in most of the circles they traveled in, they were different in some way. So there were parts of their identities that overlap, but then things that were different. And so I think that they were able to be themselves when they were with each other in really powerful ways. And certainly Baldwin had other women friends, and I think represents the women in his life in tender ways as well. But that friendship was special to him. But one of the things that I think is useful about Amen Corner is that at least for me, I get a better sense of Baldwin's relationship with his father in particular, and him coming to grips with it in Notes of a Native Son. But in his fiction, you get a real sense, not only of his relationship with the women in his life, but also his understanding of their perspective and his ability to communicate how difficult it is for them to find a space for truth, for love, for possibility, for making art in a world that is stacked against them. And so you get this really profoundly in Georgetown on the Mountain in the structure of the novel, where you have different perspectives leading the different sections. And you obviously also get it from the protagonist in Amen Corner. And so together, if you are a Baldwin fan, having read Notes of a Native Son, I think you would really be profoundly impacted by seeing Amen Corner, because it does give you an insight into both Baldwin's understanding of his relationship with his mother and women in his life, but then also their own perspective, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, we've talked a good deal about David tonight, but also Margaret, who I think is the real true tragic protagonist of the play, and is one of the most remarkable representations or portraits of a woman from mid-century American drama going through a tremendous spiritual and emotional crucible. And it reminded me, Rich, what you were saying before our little commercial break about love and spirituality. And one of the final lines in the play is Margaret coming to this realization: to love God is to love all of his children. And I hear in that Baldwin trying to hold on to a kind of non-heterodox Christian theology, even though the play is an argument maybe on the need to leave the church and be in the world. So there's the sense of her going through this extraordinary journey over the course of the play. And it's really a remarkable piece of writing. I can't think of too many other plays from any writer writing in 1955 that are like it.
Just before Rich responds to that extremely thoughtful provocation, I'm just going to flow back to Grace Hamilton. I know she's got some more thoughts from the audience, which then we can kind of share them with Rich to kind of shuffle through and deal with. Grace Hamilton.
Yeah, well, Drew, the next question I was going to ask, viewer Greg asked for the panel to comment on Sister Margaret as a tragic character. So I'm really glad you said what you said. Our viewers so well, you know where they're going next. I have two questions next about the Black church, and maybe I'll ask those, pose them to the group. And then I know we have some text that we'd like to share, so maybe we can go there next. But so here are two questions, a little broad, but we'll see what you think. The first is from viewer Meg S, and she asks, what might James Baldwin say today about the role of the Black church in solving the problem of systemic racism in the United States? So that's question one. And question two is from viewer Terry, who asks, and I think in reference to the play, The Amen Corner specifically, he says, is the church simply portrayed as toxic or as a flawed human institution comprised of flawed people? And I believe that's in reference to the play itself. So two questions about the Black church. I don't know what those bring up for the panel, if anyone would like to comment first.
Let's hand over to Rich. And also, Rich, if you could speak about Sister Margaret, tragic protagonist, ? That would also be terrific. Over to you, Rich.
No, thank you. These are incredible questions, both from Drew and from your incredibly talented and insightful viewers. Tragic. I wouldn't call her tragic because I think she's triumphant. I think ultimately triumphant. What Baldwin does really well throughout the play is to paint Sister Margaret as someone who he knows effectively, right? Someone whose interior world he's quite familiar with. And so if you think about David's relationship to Sister Margaret or her congregation relationships to her, her piety gets in the way. And that's the level of toxicity, or let's say narrowness, lack of imagination, or fail of imagination that can stymie so many and make someone go under. And the rigidity is not terribly liberating, right? But I say triumphant because she gets somewhere in terms of the journey Baldwin takes her through in her own revelation, right? Her own personal revelation happens in a way that feels almost organic, So tragic, it's true that she loses her congregation, Luke dies, and David, her son, is in the world. But at play's end, she's at peace in a kind of way. She says she's a vehicle for the gospel of love. I don't know how tragic that is, except materially, she knows she's wasted all this time, but she gets somewhere, and that's all. What Baldwin said is that she gains herself, right? So that can't be tragic if you gain yourself by going through the kind of the storm of life itself. If you gain yourself, you've won, So that's what I would say about that. The Black church now, as intervening in the political quagmire, the many political quagmires we find ourselves in, I think it's a complicated question, partly because the Black church as it existed then is not the same Black church that exists now. It seems to me that, the rise of the mega church, the kind of rupture and dislocation that attends Black people's relationship to spirituality, to religiosity, is a very different one than it was in mid-century. I think people like William Barber and people who think about the church as a morally invested, a morally kind of charged institution that has to be in the world. Those churches will impact the political outcomes of our country, but I don't see it as the same institution that it was certainly in the 19th century, and not at all what it was at mid-century, despite its limitations at every historical period. But it was a way. It's not the same church that allowed people the kind of solace, it seems to me. I don't want to insult anyone at all, but thinking about Baldwin, he had to leave the church, as David Leeming says, in order to preach the gospel. And that gospel is much more dangerous, multi-pronged, and really involved in the world, and not at all concerned with a certain kind of rigidity and piousness that might stop certain kind of political actions from proceeding apace. You know what I mean? Was there a third question as well? I'm sorry to keep missing the third one, but maybe someone else wants to jump in the second question.
I believe it was a question about systemic racism in the country and Baldwin's larger project in a literary sense, because he does write in the preface, the American Negro is a part of this country, and on the day we face this fact, not before that day, we will become a nation and possibly a great one. Right after.
We're not a nation yet, it seems to me, because that's how he ends. That's how he ends his preface, right?
Right.
That's exactly how he ends it, and it seems that day has not yet arrived. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, people. I don't think that's we have not yet landed there yet. We haven't yet arrived at that great getting of morning, the New Jerusalem that Baldwin always wanted, to kind of keep it in the religious language that so formed him and shaped him. And to my mind, gave him this kind of incredible integrity to give ourselves back to ourselves. I think the nation will gain itself the way Margaret gains herself once we ultimately realize what he said there. And that means that one has to refuse the kind of defining characteristics of the other, right? One of the things that I think most people don't take into account when dealing with Baldwin is that he doesn't really believe in race, he doesn't really believe in gender, but he knows what those things mean on the ground, right? He can't delude himself otherwise. So that last line, Drew, is very provocative. He really is talking about the changing of the world. And I think from what we can see on the borders in Texas with Haitians, the images that are coming out there that are frightful, what happens all over this groaning world, to quote the man himself, and we have not landed there yet. And I think we're dawdling in a kind of racial nightmare and a kind of racial adolescence, and haven't grown fully up into the moral responsibility, the moral adulthood, as I say in my book, that will give the nation back to itself, to the nation can achieve itself, and we can achieve this country finally. That hasn't happened yet.
Wow. Thank you, Rich. Goodness, yes. And I'm just remembering also there was something about, maybe we've covered it in a way, about the church being a toxic landscape, or was it a landscape of just flawed individuals struggling, as you say, Rich, in some kind of transitional phase. But I didn't know whether, Soyica, you'd like to kind of speak to anything that Rich has outlined or articulated in his answers there.
I would, echo. I think that Baldwin finds the church as a structure to be, he's very critical of the church as an institution, but he also is very clear that he understands what he's learned from the church and the tradition of the beloved community, and the idea of communion and love as being operating principles that continue to organize his thought and his practice as an artist. And so there's this lovely line where he says, if God doesn't make you freer, you should get rid of him. He is really understanding religion in the sense of making oneself more expansive. And this is just echoing what Rich says. But he was very, very critical of the institution. Later on, I'm going to talk some about the fire next time. But one of the things that's powerful in that text is he not only is critical of the church, but he also talks about both his seduction by the Nation of Islam and then ultimately why he doesn't join the Nation of Islam. And part of what Baldwin says when he's talking there is about how he sees power being circulated in Harlem via the Nation of Islam, and how he thinks that that's fascinating, their ability to move in the world. And so Baldwin is really trying to understand these institutions as they relate to political formations and how they're able or unable to make people freer, more so than the philosophical and religious tenets that underpin them. And so he doesn't throw that part away, but rather he is critical of this idea of these institutions that are locking people into ways of being in the world, into lifestyles that he thinks are really prohibitive, and don't move us towards a greater sense of community.
Great. Well, thank you, Soyica. And Grace, and I just want to give you a chance to, in case any viewers want to come back with anything that any responses to that, probably.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that after both of your comments, Soyica and Rich, we have several viewers just chiming in support of your thoughts, that I think, Rich, in particular, if we as a country have arrived, and there are several you're not wrongs, so much more to go, and why Baldwin is still such an important voice. So lots of support and agreement there. But back to you, Simon and Drew.
Yes, thank you, Grace. Okay, well, look, so we were going to have a look at some, I think we've got 10 minutes left, haven't we, to have a look at a passage, I think. So Drew, can I hand over to you to talk us through that?
Yeah, so, and just seconding the radicalism, the visionary quality of Baldwin, I think, is one of the reasons why the play resonates still so much today, or maybe even more in some ways. But yeah, Soyica, you were going to say, you're going to talk about the fire next time in a little bit. Why don't we talk about it now? Because we have about 10 minutes left in the show. And we've asked both of our guests, as always, to select some texts. They may be from this play, they may not be. But yeah, I'm interested in hearing why you chose this passage from the fire next time, and also hearing it.
So I chose this passage because I think it draws the arc in some ways from Amen Corner and Baldwin through his early writings that we've been talking about tonight to what people are more familiar with. And I hope that people can hear the echo in Baldwin's probably most well-known text, with the play. And so I thought that the themes, again, around love, around religion, around community, really emerge in the final words of The Fire Next Time. And so that's where this passage is from, that final paragraph. And I always find it so lovely and lush because, again, it's really Baldwin thinking both about politics and intimacy. And I think that sometimes the intimacy part can fall out of our analysis, but it's really important for Baldwin to understand that he's grappling with things at a human level. So he writes, "Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time." So you can hear some of the things that Rich was saying echoing that passage. And I also think that it, as I said, connects really profoundly to Amen Corner as well.
And also just the biblical cadence of the writing. I think that's one of the wonderful things about Baldwin, is that even as he leaves the church and is out in the world, he is so shaped by this experience of being in the church on such a molecular level in his writing. And I think it gives it a lot of its power stylistically.
Mm-hmm.
Rich, it was also wonderful to watch you mouthing along to Soyica and nodding your head and testifying and amening.
I am that 17-year-old who first read this, and so every time I see it, and you read it so beautiful, Soyica, it's always so moving. What you said about the cadence, the language, the biblical tone is always moving. And if writing can do that to you after 30 years, I mean, you're doing something right. So I'm like, I closed my eyes when you were reading Soyica. That's how powerful that is. And I've heard it a million times, not a million times, but certainly hundreds. So yes, it's just powerful. It gives me hope. It gives me a lot of hope.
Well, and like a prophecy, you get the sense that Baldwin is writing about a process that is always in process, right? This revolutionary becoming that never maybe stops until we reach that stage of New Jerusalem. And maybe is that utopia even possible? Can we aspire to that? We must, and yet it's so.
Yeah. And it's not utopia so much. I think it's more like, I mean, it's exactly what he says in the relatively conscious blacks and the relatively conscious whites. He's being very modest here, right? Do not falter in our duty now. We may be able, handful that we are, right? And he says, you only need 6 people, is what he says, to change the world, right? There's not enough humanity in the world, is what he says. But, there are people who are so powerful in their propositions, in their integrity, and in their ambition for the world that we may be able to change it, And
what I enjoy about this passage too is that he says, like lovers, if we come together like lovers, because he's really drawing attention to, when you're in a loving relationship, you are open, you are vulnerable, you are able to show all sides of yourselves. And that is what's required to create our country, that level of openness and intimacy and trust. And so that metaphor of lovers is also important, and not no romantic sense necessarily. Baldwin is just curious about, what does it mean? What do we need? What do we need to be able to be vulnerable with one another, to be honest with one another, to be truthful with one another? And he understands that those as the prerequisites of achieving our country.
And actually, it's going back to your point about this, the theatre space being a space which is peculiarly intimate. I mean, I think the theatre space is one where we kind of have to show up, and we are there physically. There isn't just the frame that we can elude each other. It's intrinsically a kind of erotic space, if you like. Now, Rich, we've got 5 minutes. I'd love to hear your passage, if you have one you'd like to share.
No, yes, there are 2 section from Act 2 that I want to make sure that we is Luke speaking. Luke, the the sinful father returned. And he's speaking kind of on his deathbed in that one conversation with David. And he said, son, don't try to get away from the things that hurt you. The things that hurt you, sometimes that's all you got. You got to learn to live with those things and use them. I've seen people put themselves through terrible torture and die because they're afraid of getting hurt. That's the first one. And later on, he says, and this is to our point, the music is a moment, but life's a long time. And that moment when it's good, when you're really swinging, then you join to everything, to everyone, to skies and stars and every living thing. The music ain't kissing what you want to do. Music, what you got to do, if you got to do it. Question is how long you can keep up with the music when you ain't got nobody to kiss. You know, the music don't come out of the air baby, it comes out of the man who's blowing it. And I mentioned that, which links back to Soyica's wonderful point about love, like lovers. And what he's saying here in the second part is that the music is sustained by being in the world, right? So you can only blow it if you have lived it, which is why Baldwin is notoriously in the world all the time, going to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning and writing until noon. And so I think that's what he's saying about the connection between that moment, but the moment is only meaningful if you've lived a life. So that's why David is going out into the world and refusing the safety that Margaret is insisting for him. And the first part of it, the first section here from kind of instruction, fatherly instruction, which I think Baldwin really wanted from his own father, wanted his father to tell him something else, was not to be safe. Right? People put themselves through terrible torture because they don't want to be hurt. This is, David, literally David from Giovanni's room. He's also called David. David Baldwin's brother is David Baldwin. So as you know from Giovanni's room, David is dangerous because he can't love anyone else. And the set of responsibilities, like lovers, as Soyica pointed out, is what makes you vulnerable and caring and responsible to someone else. If you can't love anybody else, you're really then dangerous, which is what Baldwin is also suggesting here. So those two passages, to me, instructive is the mode of address to his son, is a radical proposition in the middle of the last century to say, don't be afraid of pain. It's the stuff of life. Use it, shape it, vomit it up, shape it into art. And, but also while you're doing the music, live some life while you're at it, because that will inform the art form that you will do. So the music here for David and Luke is a writing for both David Baldwin, his stepfather, and for James Baldwin himself. So it stands in as a surrogate for Baldwin's own writing career. Drew.
Oh, just going to say really quickly, it's fascinating how this is a play of such big ideas, and yet, like all great dramas, they come out of the mouths of real human beings, of real characters, in a real time, in a real place. Hearing you talk, Rich, I flashed to seeing Chike and Antonio on stage acting that scene, and it's a son talking to his father, who the one time in his life as a conscious adult, and his father is dying, and these are his last words to his son. So it's just beautiful. I can't say enough about how much I admire this play.
Well, a real time, a real place. The Amen Corner is on until September the 26th at the Sydney Harmon Hall. If you haven't seen it already, and I know lots and lots of people tuning in tonight have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I hope tonight has whetted your appetite even further to get to the theatre and watch the show. I've certainly been reliving so much of it during our conversation this evening. My heartfelt thanks to Soyica, to Rich, for being such amazing panelists and bringing all of their knowledge and expertise and generosity of spirit to us this evening. To Drew, to Grace Ann, and indeed to all of you for joining us. Our next show is going to be on Wednesday, October the 13th, which is going to be around Remember This, The Lesson of Jan Karski, the play that we'll be presenting in the Klein Theatre. We'll be joined by director Derek Goldwyn and others to be announced soon. We hope to see you there and on the streets and in the theatre here in Washington, DC. So thanks again to our wonderful panelists, to all of you, and it's good night from me and from us all. Good night.